This is the story of how one of the biggest movie stars in the world built his dream mansion in New Jersey, gave it a name, and then spent nearly a decade trying to get rid of it. The house was called Bubble Hill, and Eddie Murphy turned it into a 25,000 square foot 32-room estate that sat on the market for roughly 8 years while the asking price collapsed by tens of millions of dollars. The sale itself didn't end the losses. The next owners lost money on it too. This isn't a story about a house falling apart. It's a story about what happens when a property gets built so specifically for one person's lifestyle that almost nobody else can use it, and what that does to its value once the owner actually wants out. The purchase. At 191 Braen Street in the East Hills section of Englewood, New Jersey, sits an affluent, private enclave in Bergen County, just minutes from the George Washington Bridge in Manhattan, and that proximity to New York City would matter a great deal later in this story. 1985 is when Eddie Murphy bought the property, early in his film career, for somewhere between $3.2 and $3.5 million, depending on which record you check. Back then, it was a much smaller house, around 10,000 square feet, built around 1980. A serious property, but nothing close to what it would become. Murphy didn't just live in the house, he rebuilt it. The expansion turned it into a 25,000 square foot estate with 32 rooms in total, sitting on close to 4 acres, with an adjacent parcel that brought the full footprint to roughly 5.5 acres. Reports on the exact number of bedrooms and bathrooms vary, with some putting it at 7 or 8 bedrooms and anywhere from 9 to 14 bathrooms. But every account agrees on one thing: this wasn't a normal house. The amenities are what made the property famous long before it became infamous for sitting unsold. Starting with a 2-lane bowling alley, an indoor pool, a racquetball court, and a tennis court. Inside, a full Art Deco movie theatre came complete with its own lobby, alongside a professional recording studio, a billiards room, a spa, and a sunroom. Outside the main living space, a 5-car garage sat near 2 elevators, 5 fireplaces, a carriage house with its own gym, and even a children's playground on the grounds. Even basic descriptions of the house don't agree with each other. Some accounts call it an all-brick Georgian-style colonial. Others describe it more simply as colonial style, and at least one source describes the very same structure as Tudor in style. What every version agrees on is the construction date, sometime around 1980, which means the bones of the house predate Murphy's ownership by roughly 5 years. Built before he ever bought it and remade almost everything inside. Murphy named the estate himself, borrowing the title Bubble Hill from his own 1989 song. Years later, an unnamed source quoted in the New York Post summed up the house in a single line, calling it "built by an entertainer for an entertainer." That description sounds like a compliment, but it would later become the exact reason the house was so hard to sell. By 2004, Murphy was ready to move on, and on January 3rd of that year, the property hit the market for $30 million through listing agent Mary Lenk of Bergdorf Realtors, with the listing announced publicly through a press release on luxuryrealestate.com. That price reportedly made it one of the most expensive single-family listings in the entire state of New Jersey. Lenk sounded confident about what she was selling, telling reporters when the listing went public, "It's an absolutely magnificent, stupendous house." $30 million, though, is a very specific kind of number. It doesn't just require a buyer with money. It requires a buyer who wants exactly this house, with exactly these features, in exactly this location, and for years, that buyer simply never showed up. Why it wouldn't sell? Roughly 8 years is how long the house sat on the market, and during that stretch, the asking price came down again and again. From $30 million in 2004, it slid to somewhere around $19 to $19.5 million by 2007, then down to $15.9 million by August of 2009, and down again to $14.99 million that same fall. June of 2010 brought another drop to $12.75 million, and by 2012, brokers were calling roughly $12 million the rock-bottom price. Well over half the original asking price disappeared over the better part of a decade, and that raises an obvious question. What actually went wrong here? Timing explains part of it. The housing market collapsed nationally starting in 2008, and luxury real estate was not immune, which meant buyers with the kind of money this house required suddenly got far more cautious and far less willing to overpay out of politeness. Charles Gildear of Marin Gildear and Donahue Realtors in Saddle River, who worked the broader New Jersey luxury market at the time, put it plainly to reporters. "Buyers are very savvy," he said. "They're shopping around and they know the market well, and they're not as worried about hurting the seller's feelings." Timing alone, though, doesn't explain an 8-year sale, and the bigger issue was the house itself. Dennis McCormick, a broker with Prominent Properties Sotheby's International Realty who worked on the listing, said the property was priced incorrectly from the very start, meaning $30 million was never the right number for what this house, in this location, could actually command. Then there was the matter of upkeep. $257,876 a year is the figure reported for the property's annual tax bill, and that's not a one-time cost. That's every single year the house sits unsold, with nobody living in it, generating no income, and draining money regardless. A bowling alley, a recording studio, and an Art Deco theatre are not features that appeal to the average buyer with $30 million to spend, since even most ultra-wealthy buyers don't necessarily want to inherit somebody else's idea of a perfect party house. The very things that made Bubble Hill remarkable also shrank its potential buyer pool down to almost nothing. Still, the location carried real value, and at least one agent involved in the broader market made the case for why a buyer would eventually show up. Michael Kolsky, a real estate agent active in the area, explained the appeal of Englewood's East Hill specifically. "This is the closest mileage to New York City for anyone on Wall Street or in the music industry," he said. "Only here can you have a house like this, come home to tuck your kids in bed, and be back in the city 20 minutes later." That argument turned out to be right. It just took 8 years and a 60% cut to the original price to prove it. The sale. May of 2012 is when the property finally went under contract, and by October, reports surfaced identifying the buyers as Grammy-winning singer Alicia Keys and her husband, producer Swizz Beatz, known legally as Kasim Dean. Keys' business manager, Todd Gelfand, structured the deal, acting as trustee of something called the Honeycomb Trust, and the sale closed around April of 2013. Bergen County records break the transaction into 2 parts. $10,425,000 for the main parcel and $1,675,000 for the adjacent lot, a combined total of roughly $12.1 million. Some of Murphy's furniture reportedly stayed behind as part of the deal, passed along to the new owners rather than hauled out with the moving trucks. For a house built around such specific custom features, handing off pieces of the original furnishings made a certain kind of sense, even if that detail rarely makes it into the headlines. $18 million is roughly the gap that separated Murphy's original $30 million ask from that final $12 million closing price, after 8 years and at least 6 rounds of public price cuts. The next owners lose money too. Here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, because the mansion's reputation as a liability didn't end when Murphy sold it, it followed the house to its next owners. Keys and Swizz Beatz lived in the property for a couple of years before relisting it in 2015 at $14.9 million, a price that found no buyer, and by 2016 they pulled it off the market entirely. August of 2021 brought another attempt, this time at $9.99 million, already a steep markdown from what they'd originally paid, and on April 14th, 2022, the house finally sold to an undisclosed buyer for $6 million. By the time that final sale closed, the listing itself described a more modest version of the house on paper, 6 bedrooms and 10 full bathrooms. a noticeably smaller count than the 7, 8, or even 14 bathrooms floated in earlier reporting on the property, suggesting the house had been reconfigured again somewhere along the way. Run the numbers, and the picture gets stark fast. $12.1 million is roughly what Keys and Swizz Beatz paid for the property back in 2013, and 9 years later, they sold it for $6 million, a loss of roughly $6 million stacked on top of nearly a decade of those same six-figure annual property taxes. The couple had already relocated by this point. $28 million bought them a home in La Jolla, California, known as the Razor House, back in 2019, and Bubble Hill, by comparison, had become something they were simply trying to exit. The house didn't sell itself, and across nearly 2 decades, it passed through more than one listing team. When Murphy first put the house on the market in 2004, Mary Lenk of Bergdorf Realtors held the listing. The same agent who called it an absolutely magnificent, stupendous house when it debuted at $30 million. By around 2010, with the price already cut by more than half, the listing had moved to Dennis McCormick at Prominent Properties Sotheby's International Realty, the broker who later explained that the original number had simply been wrong from the start. Ownership changed hands in 2013, but the pattern of struggling to sell didn't end there. When Alicia Keys and Swizz Beatz relisted the property themselves, first in 2015 and again years later, the listing went through Christie's International Real Estate Northern New Jersey, working out of the firm's Franklin Lakes office. Agent Chris Bowl handled that stretch of the property's history, guiding it through the 2021 relisting and the eventual $6 million sale in April of 2022. 3 different brokerages, spanning 3 different decades, all worked to move the same house. And that alone says something about how difficult this particular property was to place. Not an isolated case. This sounds like an unusually specific kind of failure, but Bubble Hill wasn't the only Englewood mega mansion to suffer this fate. Not far away, a 28-room property known as the Gloria Crest Estate, once linked to silent film era history, hit the market in 2013 for $39 million. Then went through more than 8 price cuts and 4 different listing agents before finally selling years later for $4.6 million, an 88% discount off its original asking price. $13,653 a month, well over $160,000 a year, was the property's monthly tax bill, and the listing agent estimated it would need somewhere between $3 and $5 million in renovations on top of the purchase price. That listing agent, Michelle Pace, CEO of Signature Realty New Jersey, offered a line that applies just as well to Bubble Hill as it does to the house she was selling. "A home is worth what a buyer is willing to pay for it," she said. "What a buyer wants and what an appraiser says is irrelevant." Ultra-customized, ultra-expensive single-purpose mansions in this part of New Jersey had a pattern, sitting unsold for years and eventually trading for a fraction of their original price. Bubble Hill turned out to be far from a one-off curiosity. A note on a different house. One quick clarification belongs here, because it comes up often when people search for this story online. Eddie Murphy also owned a separate mansion in Granite Bay, California, sometimes confused with Bubble Hill. But that property sits on the opposite side of the country entirely. Murphy and his then-wife, Nicole Mitchell Murphy, sold the Granite Bay home in 2007 for $6.1 million. Real estate investor Patrick Willis bought the property afterward, and the house went through its own slow decline in asking price. $12 million is what it was listed for in 2014, and by May of 2018, it appeared back on the open market at $10 million. None of those numbers held. The house ultimately sold at auction in December of 2018 for $5.5 million to an unidentified buyer, and it reportedly changed hands once more in early 2025 for $3.5 million. That California property has its own story of declining value, a smaller, separate echo of the same pattern. But it is not Bubble Hill, and the two shouldn't be conflated. Bubble Hill is, and has only ever been, the Englewood, New Jersey estate at the center of this video. Separating fact from internet rumor. Search for Bubble Hill online today, and a few claims show up that sound plausible but don't hold up. One version of the story credits the original house to architect Joseph Urban, suggesting he designed the structure Murphy later bought and expanded. The timeline alone rules that out. Joseph Urban died in 1933, and the house wasn't built until around 1980, nearly 5 decades later. So whoever built the original structure, it wasn't him. The same retelling goes further, claiming that musician Nile Rodgers and singer Dionne Warwick each owned the property before Murphy did. No reliable source backs that up. It isn't confirmed in property records, in real estate coverage, or in any of the reporting done around Murphy's original 2004 listing, when journalists would have had every reason to mention famous previous owners if any had existed. None of this changes the actual story. Eddie Murphy bought a roughly 10,000 square foot house in 1985, expanded it into the 25,000 square foot, 32-room estate that became Bubble Hill, and that version is supported by tax records, listing history, and contemporary news coverage. The embellished version, with a famous architect and a chain of celebrity owners before Murphy, isn't supported by anything beyond a single low-quality web post repeating a claim nobody else has verified. That matters for a story like this one. The real numbers, the real price cuts, and the real losses are dramatic enough on their own, and they don't need an invented backstory to make the point. Bubble Hill's story comes down to a fairly simple pattern playing out twice in a row. Eddie Murphy built a mansion that was, by every account, extraordinary. A bowling alley, a private movie theatre, and a recording studio, all under one roof, on nearly 4 acres minutes from Manhattan, and he named it after his own song. When he tried to sell it, though, he discovered that a house built specifically for one person's life is a very hard thing to sell to anyone else. 8 years passed, and a series of price cuts dragged the asking price down from $30 million to around $12 million, before Alicia Keys and Swizz Beatz finally bought it. Even they couldn't escape the pattern. 9 years later, they sold it for $6 million, half of what they'd paid. A house built to be a permanent monument to one entertainer's tastes ended up being something else entirely. A financial liability that 2 separate sets of owners spent nearly 2 decades combined trying to put behind them. If stories like this one pull you in, the rise, the fall, and the fine print most people never hear, that's exactly what Backstage Hollywood is built around. Every video here digs past the headline and into the paperwork, the price cuts, and the numbers nobody talks about at the premiere. Subscribe to Backstage Hollywood, turn on notifications, and you won't miss the next story like this one, a famous name attached to a house that almost nobody could actually afford to keep.